for the past 3 or 4 years, I think it's been almost 4 years now, I've been organizing a variety of events like this for students and faculty that explore some of the tensions and theories behind the practices of global citizenship. And the centerpiece of this project has been this workshop, this series of conversations that brings a small group of undergraduates together with an extraordinary person who embodies an ethical and professional commitment to global engagement of the sort that challenges our notions of the world and inspires all of us to action of similar sorts or new actions as well. And I found that the small size of these conversations gives us space to be closer, to learn more, to be in real conversation with one another. And so we'll be talking as this group as a whole, and then we'll split in half to do small group conversations for a little bit, and then we'll come back to this group toward the end of our conversation here for direct Q&A with Mr. Borgen. We've had in the past people working in the fields of public health, global public health and global medicine and journalism and documentary filmmaking and human rights advocacy, migrants and refugee advocacy, et cetera. And so tonight it's a real honor to bring into conversation, into the series and into this Zoom room tonight, Clint Borgen. You've read a little bit about his bio, and so I'd like to just get us kicked off by asking you, Clint, to tell us just a little bit about the Borgen Project, how it came to be and what it does, and then we'll move on to your relationship with the work you do. So welcome.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you having me, and sorry I couldn't do this in person. I hope the timing wasn't really good on my my son being born, but other than that, I'd love to do it in person in the future. But yeah, so this just to lay it out here too, like ask lots of questions as we go along. There's no such thing as a dumb question. So I hopefully, if nothing else, feel free to approach any topic or anything you want me to discuss. It's your guys' time to really kind of learn about anything. So yeah, I'm the founder of an organization called the Borgen Project, and we work with members of Congress to get them doing more to address global poverty than they otherwise would. You can kind of think of it as like lobbyists for the world's poor. That the initial idea came from it. I'd volunteered after my sophomore year of college. I went and volunteered over in Kosovo when that war was going on. I worked over in refugee camps, and at the time there had been like 800,000 people had fled the country, and 10,000 had been killed within a 3-month period. So it's just a pretty chaotic deal over there. And that's my first time going overseas or traveling abroad. And I was just kind of blown away by the whole situation. Obviously, I grew up in a small town in the Northwest, outside Seattle, between Seattle and Canada, kind of up in called Anacortes, way up north of the Northwest. And I grew up with a very patriotic upbringing. I kind of assumed the U.S. was always out there saving the world and doing wonderful things. And kind of what I saw on the ground was I saw both what we can do as a nation, and then also I definitely saw some shortcomings as I felt the country areas but when I say country, I should say our U.S. leaders and how our foreign policy interacts with the rest of the world. So, but yeah, when you're on the ground, you see the basic human needs of food, water, and shelter. You realize it really doesn't take a whole lot to improve conditions for people. But then you also see other stuff like one example I always point out. So landmines were everywhere there at the time. It was one of those heavily mined countries in the world. And I remember one time we were driving with the driver in this remote area, and he stopped the car. I had to go to the bathroom. I started to walk over in the bushes to the bathroom. He goes, no, don't leave the cement. Like it's just not safe to leave the cement there. And that was just random place. We happened to stop, but there's just, heavily mined area, right? So and you start looking into it and learning more, and it's like, okay, why do landmines still exist? There's this treaty years ago. It's actually the work was done by the Vietnam Veterans of America organization to ban landmines, and the U.S. for years had never signed this treaty. And we had, whatever strategic reasons based off the South Korea border, border North Korea, and yada yada yada. But on the ground, this stuff gets more personal, right? Because kids were 80% of people killed by landmines are kids. They go out in the fields, they play, they get they blown up by them. My first day in the refugee camp there's a kid found an unexploded landmine in his tent where the tent had been set up. So some of the stuff gets a lot more personal when you're on the ground, and then back in the U.S. you see kind of the policy side and why it may or may not make sense policy wise. But when you kind of boil stuff down to the humans having to live with these policies, it kind of it makes you a little lights a little fire in your belly. And so I definitely came back very much feeling that there's definitely a lot more the U.S. or leaders could be doing to address these issues, and kind of that sense I had previously that all was well and all was being done well, I definitely didn't have. So the initial idea was really create an organization that could put pressure on U.S. leaders and get them doing more to address global poverty. I had no idea how to do this. I was just out of college. So when I actually first started doing it, I started building an organization just out of college. Had no idea how to go about this. I still had student loans to pay off, and I started just basically researching. Spent a lot of time online. Had no funding, no knowledge of policy, no knowledge of anything, and just kind of spent a lot of time learning as much as I could. I graduated like right after 9/11, so it was like 2 months after 9/11 struck. I graduated in December. I'm from a small town we have big ties to the fishing industry up in Alaska, Dutch Harbor, Alaska. So, and my mom worked for a fishing company, and they were always looking for guys or people to live on the boat in the off season, because like none of the fishermen wanted to do it because it's horrible, because you just be isolated for 3 months at a time. But for me, it's like my opportunity to start this organization, and I didn't quite know where all it was going. I didn't quite know what I was doing or how to go about it. But the opportunity to like live on this boat in the middle of nowhere, and for those who watched the show, The Deadliest Catch, that's where we were. And that they just started recording that. I saw people around with cameras a little bit, but not a whole lot. But it's kind of funny to see like all these guys you'd see out chain smoking, so become these celebrities of reality TV. It's kind of interesting. But so long story short, that was the early basically year and a half. I'd go up there to do 3 month stints at a time, and I lived in this 190-foot fishing vessel down at just slightly about sea level of where the boat was. There was like no windows, it was all steel. And I would just sit there at I had my little laptop set up on the kitchen galley table there. Lived alone and just heard all sorts of creaking noises. If you're on a fishing boat in a very windy place, it's so I would just kind of sit there rocking back and forth, working at my little laptop. It was docked next to a cannery, so I had like internet cords running. I basically duct taped together a bunch of phone cords, like 300 feet of phone cords, and ran it from the cannery, the dock there, down through the door and down to where I was. So really weird, right, up way to start an organization, but it was actually kind of perfect, because like up there, especially in winter, it was like just dark a lot, and down where I lived, it was always, I had no sense of day or night anyway, so it kind of gave that perfect conditions. Just spend hours and hours learning, figuring out what I was doing all the initial development, all the initial paperwork for the organization. But basically the first 2 years at least of the organization was just me. And I don't know if you want me to keep transitioning through the story, if you want to kind of go different directions.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one thing that strikes me immediately was that why not an organization around landmines, or around war and peace, or around some of the things that you have just described as being as moving, stirring your conscience during those years, during that time abroad. What led you to think about poverty as the thing that you wanted to work on?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I guess the main answer I have, and it would have been, I'll give you two different paths I was looking at, right? And part of my past come from absolute stupidity of not knowing anything about how to do a policy organization, how to do yada yada. But that has also sometimes been very helpful, I think, organization through years. And I'll give you an example of how that works. So if we had focused, say, just on landmines, there would be a very limited number of things we could do around that topic, right? So we could, in theory, work on getting that treaty signed by Congress, which I think the Obama administration, they've done away with that now. The U.S. has now signed that treaty. We probably could then work around trying to get unexploded landmines funding the U.S. Congress to address some of our unexploded mines in like Laos and some of these different countries where we've used them and not picked them up. But what we see as an organization is there's limited number of bills related to, say, do-gooderness, global do-gooderness, that get introduced in Congress. So as it is now, I look at some groups that are like just do clean water, and that's an issue we've dabbled in. We worked on bills around it. And I think that would be really hard if you have this huge, group of people across the country who are fired up, ready to go, working or can do advocacy, building support around it, and there's no legislation to work on, or you're just doing the appropriations, which is like a annual cycle. There's stuff to be doing throughout the year. But basically, it would kind of limit what we could work on, is the short answer. But by kind of broadly focusing, we're able to we've been working on COVID this last, since COVID struck in global development countries. And so in development countries, so there kind of gives you more opportunities to do more with the existing organizations been created. That the bad side is that we're not the think tank experts on just access to clean water, just landmines. So it's kind of every time, there's pros and cons for sure, but I think it's definitely given us a lot more flexibility, and we've frankly been able to pass more legislation to help more people by being this way. But there would definitely be, a lot of times would prefer we just did one specific topic and I just learned about that and didn't worry about any other things I'd have to learn about. But
So one other thing that strikes me early on is the pretty breathtaking ambition to try to influence Congress as a guy in a boat off the shore of Alaska. Many people, especially young people, but also, regular old people like me, have a sense sometimes that we're disconnected from the levers of government, that the system works without us, and that rich and powerful people in other places are making all these decisions, and that one vote doesn't mean much. So could you kind of speak a bit about how you came to terms with that, and how you decided that this was the giant lever you were going to be pulling on, as opposed to convincing one person in one place to spend a little bit, maybe your neighbor Bill Gates, and spending a little bit more on this or that, as opposed to going to the belly of the beast from the West Coast?
I think a lot of that's born out of where I was. So Coastal was a very political, by virtue of the U.S. involvement in that war. So I kind of saw right away just the impact the U.S. can have in all these countries. I also saw that a lot of countries are very engaged in these topics, and the U.S. typically hadn't been signing a lot of these treaties and hadn't been as involved in all this stuff. So initially it was just purely like, these are the individuals that have the power to like address a lot of this. As I started digging more into it as well, you look at a lot of the groups on the ground, they're doing great work. A lot of the bills and legislation we're passing is getting funding that's granted out to a lot of the bigger agencies on the ground that are doing the work. But even their budgets are pretty dang minuscule compared to what the US can do globally. The Gates Foundation, their impact they're having on these issues are amazing, but they give a fraction of what the US gives annually to addressing global poverty and development. So in terms of like where it's at for having impact, it's really policy in Congress. It's even boiled down to, it's 435 members in the House, 100 in the Senate, but they looked at that at the committees, it's kind of a lot smaller number of people. So a lot of just if you get influence on those individuals, that's where we've seen a lot of good stuff happen. Our grassroots is hugely important. And I was like incredibly skeptical about whether, emailing Congress mattered and all that stuff. We just didn't, as an organization, we just didn't even do any of that stuff for the first few years at least. And then as we started to get access to members of Congress and different staffers that were friendly to the cause would give us advice, the thing I kept hearing over and over again was you need to have people in their congressional districts reach out to their leaders and support the bill. There's one member of Congress who used to be on our board, and he would always talk about 5 people in his district call him about any given bill in the morning. By afternoon, his staff has notified him about that bill. So, some of the bigger offices like your senators of New York, those can be you need to generate more calls and emails. But like a lot of these congressional districts are quite small, usually a little over 600,000 people. Most people don't call or contact their leaders at all. And if you boil down who is, those certain hot topics will get contacted a lot about, like Ukraine, they're probably hearing a ton on that particular issue, or immigration. But when people call us about specific stuff like please support the global Fragility Act or things along those lines, it gets noticed pretty easily. So, our 1-2 punch is we have the grassroots folks all across the country, and our great interns have been a huge part of that. They're really what's really driven a lot of the success the organization's had. Very tremendously and sincerely, we've just had incredible individuals in congressional districts across the country who are mobilizing other individuals and generating that push. So so at this stage, we're kind of in a good position where we have, as an organization, direct access. We'll meet with anywhere from 90 to 95% of the U.S. Senate every year, bipartisan, people who are completely against this stuff and people who are for it. And then we have a great grassroots who are doing getting out, mobilizing people to call and email. And all those offices, by the way, they tally that stuff too, right? So if anyone on this call right now could mobilize 5 people to call in support of, to call in their leaders. Ideally, if you do in the same congressional district, that's super helpful, but to call them in support of any given bill if you care about, it doesn't have to be global poverty, or it could be anything. And that's going to get on that leader's radar and their staff too. And every office is slightly different in how they do it, but almost all have this software system that tracks it and makes sure the right people see it. So that I found super empowering after launching an organization, because the early days I was like, oh, how do I get where they think I'm halfway important enough to talk to, and I can go and meet with them and lobby. And that was some of the initial back of my mind stuff, launching it. And then after those pieces kind of started to come to play, it became real apparent that it's really all about people, to people in their district, that they really have the most influence. And a lot of times I would say way more influence over their leaders than like your typical high-powered lobbyists that we always hear about, the from whatever industry. So that I've found kind of surprising and shocking. But yeah, they really do care about what people in their district are reaching out to them about.
Hmm. Can you say a little bit about the mechanics of your organization? Like how many people work there, and how do you do the internships? What's your your strategy for leveraging interest on certain things, including what kinds of reasons do you use? Is it enough to simply say that a constituent wants to support this bill, or does it matter why?
In terms of their outreach to their leaders, or
I'm wondering, so in terms of being a mission-driven organization, we'll start to shift into your own values and the mission here as well, but there are a wide variety of organizations and people who might want to reduce global inequality or address poverty for a lot of different reasons, whether it's economic or religious or humanistic or environmental or justice oriented in many different ways. How do you tell us a little bit about the mechanics of the work, and then also the values behind that work?
Okay. Yeah, so structurally we have 5 full-time staff, and then typically between 12 and 14 part-time staff. We have volunteers in all 50 states, typically throughout the course of a given year. And then we have a board of directors made up of people of different backgrounds. We have the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee on our board. He's a Democrat, and we have the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee on our board as well. He's a Republican. So it's definitely all about having nonpartisan product, and something that we don't care who you vote for. We just care that you want to see poverty addressed, and bringing those individuals together, and making sure we're all fighting for the same basic focus. And then structurally, we have a network of grassroots volunteers across the country as well. And one thing we started doing, I guess it was almost 8 years ago now, was a lot of our volunteers were college age students who were like, well, this is great. I was wondering if there's any way I can get college credit for it. And that was something hadn't been really on our radar. But then we kind of started to look and exploring like remote internship ways. We always do the internship remotely that would help achieve basically the same objectives of having that strong volunteer in any given congressional district that was mobilizing and working. So that kind of ended up basically being where our remote internship programs were born out of. And then we just saw really good results, and frankly, way better results from people doing remote internships versus people who might have been like, say mid-career and working at Microsoft during the day and had a wife and 2 kids like me, and didn't necessarily have the time to like fully dedicate to volunteering. So we were just seeing really good results out of our internship program, and people going and meeting with their congressional leaders in their districts, and those leaders co-sponsoring the bills they were asking them to. So that really prompted us to kind of build out our remote internship program as well. So that's been really important to the overall results of the organization.
Mm-hmm. And do you push for a particular way of? You mentioned that it's bipartisan, of course. I guess I'm wondering, in part, one part of me as an ethics professor says, who would possibly say that it's a bad idea to try to reduce global poverty? And some people might. I guess I'm wondering, is the persuasion you're trying to do primarily about priorities, putting poverty above something else as an expenditure, or is it also partly about convincing people that this is a problem as such that ought to be addressed?
Yeah, so I'll answer it from the standpoint of or direct outreach to Congress, but if you want me to back up on the people-wide scale, that's fine too. So there are people who don't want these issues addressed. I mean, I get hate mail. There's people who don't want their tax dollars going to a bunch of people in overseas or in other countries, and so there's definitely like a very vocal demographic. It's a small number, mind you, but it's a very out there number. We've heard from several members of Congress, they never go to town hall without someone standing up saying, why we shouldn't give any money to foreign aid, and this and that. One challenge of our topic is foreign aid includes every good and bad you can think of, right? You don't talk about domestic aid. We talk about U.S. healthcare and traffic, and but everyone lumps the war in Iraq, helping starving people, global whatever, like anything global gets lumped into that word, right? So I always, it's one of my favorite things is someone says 848, I'm like, what do you hate about it? I'm like, all right, I hate that part too. So but the stuff we're talking about is the stuff that helps people help themselves out of poverty. So yeah, so anyways, that's, I'm off topic there, but yeah, I don't know if I think I lost my
Sure. No, that's fine. That there are some people who actually don't want it on the agenda,
right.
but others who are trying to find a place for it amidst other concerns, right?
Yes, yeah.
Let's shift a little bit back toward your own personal story then. We heard a little bit about the origins of this work, but what kinds of challenges did you meet and obstacles? How long now have you been at this?
19 years now almost. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the early obstacles and how you
Yeah.
faced those and move through those, not just in the success of your professional organization, but also, in your own life in doing this work.
Yeah. I'll give you all the behind the scenes gritty part here, but so basically my naivete was I'd start an organization, we'd start doing good things, donations would magically appear, and all would be well in the world, and we would just keep on keeping on and make an impact. And what I found out is, fundraising is incredibly difficult, and fundraising for global stuff is difficult. Fundraising for anything political is difficult, and fundraising for someone who was like super shy, voted most bashful in high school, growing up. And for me, I had like a lot of, I was raised not to talk about money or ask my parents for anything at the store. So I'm just kind of getting into the groove of like feeling comfortable talking to people and asking them to give. And that was very challenging to me. So for first, early days of the organization, very, very rudimentary. So after my year and a half time back and forth and up in Alaska, I briefly for a while worked a day job and then worked, just ran the organization out of my apartment from in the evenings. And by ran, that really wasn't much. It was still basically me at that point, and starting to do kind of learn more about volunteer recruitment, all that good stuff. At one point, it started to kind of get going a little bit. By get going, I mean doing slightly better. We rented out this tiny, or I rented out this tiny little office space in a building. Started to bring on some volunteers and a handful of volunteers in office, but still it was pretty rudimentary. By year 3 or 4, I think I had my first meeting with a congressional leader. That part I was kind of trying to figure out more and didn't want to make a fool of the organization at the get-go. So I was trying to, get that all dialed in. And then that started to get moving, and we're starting to be able to actually get meetings. So I was able to get meetings with all these leaders. But at this point, so I'm still unpaid, but I need to be doing it full time because things were starting to move. So I got in a position where I would run the organization during the day, and then evenings I'd go work at either restaurants, or most of the time I was doing room service at a hotel. So that was my existence for basically first 10 years of organization. I didn't draw a salary at all. I wasn't paid. So it was always like this balancing act of like running this organization and then evenings, like, delivering room service on my tray and all that fun stuff. So it's very kind of weird existence. Also, at one point I had it where like we got donated office space. My apartment was directly across the street from the office space. 2 blocks down was the hotel I worked at. So I had like this little weird world, and I worked a lot of weekends and Sundays at the restaurant as well. So where I just was stuck in downtown Seattle, didn't go more than a few blocks for, I won't say several years, but it was like a good chunk of my existence there for a while. So it was, that's kind of what it kind of takes to get going. In those days, it was definitely a weird conflict because we were, I'd go back to DC, get the big meetings, and our funding was low. So I'd cram in a bunch of meetings. I'd have it scheduled out where I'd basically be meeting every 30 minutes with a different office and kind of, speed walking between offices. And sometimes we do 50 or 60 meetings in a week. And these weeks were like my time off from my other job. So it's like they didn't give us vacation pay, but if they did, that would have been what it was being used for. So it's kind of weird existence though, but the organization was growing and doing good, and all these people get involved. We're getting the big meetings with members of Congress. But in the evening, I was still like the guy who was like scrubbing down the tables after you ate at our restaurant and getting yelled at by my manager for not sharpening, making sure the spoons were polished enough. And so that was like just sort of the existence for several years of that. And that's something I always warn people, like if you're starting a nonprofit, I think there's kind of, most people don't just sort of don't think about the funding part. And even people are pretty good at fundraising. It's still, it's definitely a challenging thing. I always encourage everyone though to learn it and get out of your comfort zone and kind of push yourself on it. Because whether you go the nonprofit route or you go the business route and you want to raise funding to start a company, if you're Elon Musk and you just bought Twitter, you had to reach out to different people and ask them to give money to your ambition of buying Twitter. So and it's just one of those things that it's worth knowing, like how to how to like communicate what you're trying to do and asking people to be part of it for sure.
Do you think that uh, there has to be some measure of humility involved when you're doing this kind of work in both places? You're doing two jobs, and you're doing a job to make ends meet on one hand, and you're doing a job that you're committing to as a value system also on the others. Do you think that what sorts of lessons beyond the time management and what kinds of lessons came to you in the midst of this sort of phase where you had to do multiple things at one time and kept low to the ground?
Yeah, it definitely was a weird like brain disconnect of and my restaurant workers or people I worked at the restaurant, now I'm doing anything about the Borgen Project or what I was doing there until we started getting media coverage, and that kind of got out of the bag a little bit. But yeah, so that was a little bit of a weird disconnect. I would say I think part of it, looking back, it was really good I did all that, right? Both from the humbling standpoint, not I've come from a humble background, so that part I wasn't too worried about, but like the small talk you're doing when you're working at restaurants, I tell anyone who ever asked me who's still in college or doing an internship with us, if they ask advice, I always say work customer service jobs, work things where you have to interact with people all day long, because that's just a skill we're not learning as well, just through the natural process of the way things are, digitally now or whatever. But so that's something I really transferred over, I think, a lot, forcing me out of the shell, forcing me to interact with people all day or all evening long. And that helped a lot with the lobbying. It helped a lot with it. Just you got me more comfortable in any kind of the social position that we're dealing with, whether it's dealing with political leaders or whatever. I will say, like when we first started really doing, I remember a phase of the organization where it was like all sounds like, oh, I have to meet with a CEO. I've never met a CEO before in my life. When I was just terrified, or I have to meet with a member of Congress. And there's a period there, like I swear, like every other morning I was throwing up out of nervousness, and everything was like so out of my realm of comfort. But that was a really important period though, right? Like looking back, that was like a period that a lot of growth for me personally occurred. So I definitely, things that there's that old saying about do one thing every day that scares you. I have not been living that lately. I need to push myself more on other stuff. But I will say, when you do get in that zone, you really do grow a lot as a person. Everything just gets considerably more, I won't use the word easy, but you just get more comfortable with any scenario you can think of for the most part.
Thanks. Can you tell us a little bit about how you would describe your core values? I mean, what are the things that you hold true to, and have they changed over the past 20 years you've been doing this? Have these values been maybe challenged in some way by what you've seen, or affirmed in some ways? Tell us a little bit about that sort of commitment to values.
Yeah. So I was raised by an elementary school principal, and he dealt with misbehaving kids all day long. So when he came home, his kids were there was very little wiggle room for you definitely wouldn't lie to dad, because you knew he would know you're full of crap. And so I was just looking back, well, definitely raised, be honest, be truthful. That was a pretty huge one. And I didn't think a whole lot of that. And I think at different periods of life, you're like, wow, you see some people getting ahead who are doing, maybe not following that. But now I'm like, man, I've always been about it, but now I'm like, it really does make a huge difference. And you see, I see it in all different facets, everything from the political work, obviously, to sometimes you have team members who are great, and then you catch them fibbing on stuff, and you just kind of don't quite, the trust is broken after that, and it doesn't quite, so it creates, I guess what I'm saying, I think people create a lot more problems for themselves by not being ethical or honest than they necessarily realize. And as humans, I think we have these weird little quirks, right? Like you feel okay lying to the police officer who pulls you over, the teacher whose paper you're late turning in, or the boss who you skip town for a concert instead of going to work. But those people deal with a lot of lying, right? So they generally know if you're telling the truth or not. So it's kind of one of those things. You might have won, what's that saying? You won the something something, but you won the race.
Win the battle, but lose the war.
There you go. Yeah. So I just can't stress enough the importance of just, it can be challenging sometimes, but just really sticking to your guns and being who you want to be as a person and trying to remember who that person you want to be is. And this sort of goes on the same lines, but I think, now, I'm trying to think how to describe this. We all live daily, but there's a lot to be said about just following through on stuff. I know we're all super busy with our phones. I know big time when also my emails and everything were in my phone in my hand. It made it a little more challenging. But I have friends that if they say they'll call, they call. If they say they'll be there, they'll be there. And those people really stand out in your life as you go through your life, because a lot of people don't. And even like kind of the simple stuff of like, my sister's really bad about this. She's like, oh yeah, we might come over Saturday. Great. Yeah, that's nice. I'll just sit here and hang out until you decide, and I won't make plans with anyone else. And so it's just kind of like some of the simple stuff that we all are guilty of doing. It really says something to people when you're like, not sure if you get around to doing it, not sure you care enough to go. But the people are like, I'll be there Saturday at 10, and they show up at Saturday at 10. That really stands out, right? So I would encourage you definitely to kind of try to stick to that. I know it's hard. I'm don't take me as an example, someone who lives this perfectly, but it does. I just look at people who I really respect in my life, and it's kind of sticking to what people stick to what they say is kind of underlying quality of those individuals.
Yeah, that's helpful. Before we one last question before we break out into groups to talk amongst ourselves a bit, and that's around the idea of global citizenship. Is that a term that you employ or embrace? And if so, tell us about what that means to you. And if not, why not?
Yeah, this is a good question. I do really like the term because more often than not, when I talk to people about what we do, if I'm talking to just random relatives or whoever, I get that. What about poverty at home, or that whole we should focus just on what's going on here domestically? And I get that, but the reality is overseas the issues are just night and day. So like I use the example, I've been in villages in East Africa where so here the stereotype of homeless person is someone jumping in the garbage can and taking out food, right? In all these countries, there's no garbage can to jump into. If there was, there'd be 15 people who already got there before you and got the food. So it's just the resource difference between what's going on in some of these parts of the world versus here is phenomenal. We do need to address poverty here. That's super important. We should all be active and fighting the good fight here. But I think it's important to take a step back and look at the world through the lens of if you're up in the sky and where's the biggest needs and what can be done to do those things. And there's just not the resources in all these regions to do it. And if it's not some form of assistance, appropriately done assistance, I should say, then it's pretty challenging for a lot of these countries to get the next leg up.
So do you have any reservations about the term? Do you hear beyond the idea that we ought to focus on ourselves instead of others? Do you hear people suggesting that maybe we ought to not see people as citizens but as people, or that that's an inaccessible concept for some people who need to focus on smaller things rather than grand abstractions or anything like that? Or do you find that's compelling for everyone to think in those terms?
It's a good question. So I guess I haven't heard any specific pushback on the term, and I'm sort of visually focusing. Like when you say it, I'm picturing just people being globally engaged. But maybe, if there's more you guys have dealt with on that topic, I'd love to hear more about too. So that's
Oh, no problem. Just it's always helpful to get a starting point to hear how it resonates with you. So let's break out into groups. I'm going to first paste a set of questions for everyone to talk about. We're going to break in half. And I'll paste a full set of questions here, and then I'll do it again when the breakout groups happen. So in case that they don't transfer into the groups, and you'll Clint and I will bounce around between. I've given him access to be a co-host, and if you're able to jump into one or the other session, that's great. If you need to take a break for a few minutes, Clint, that's fine too.
Welcome back. I hope you guys had a good conversation. It was nice to pop in and out of them, and to hear some of your reflections on global citizenship and your career paths and things you want to build on or work on as you approach the rest of your time at BC and beyond. During the first half of our session tonight, I had the opportunity to ask a bunch of questions to Clint and to hear a bit, but now is the opportunity for you all to do that on whatever topic that you want, whether it's professional or ethical or global or interpersonal or whatever. So I want to simply open the floor to questions, and I know that he has said he's open to answer anything you like. So anyone can jump in as you wish.
Yes, so I was wondering, when did you realize that you wanted to also incorporate like a Borgen magazine and blog? Was that later on after realizing that you wanted, to mobilize, like get people on board with lobbying Congress and getting funding for everyone to call the representatives, et cetera? And when did how did that look like? How did that process in getting journalists and getting writers on board with the Borgen project?
Yeah, that kind of, early on we kind of knew, general public awareness around these issues is incredibly important, and kind of engaging people around different topics. So that was kind of the initial thought behind doing particularly the magazine. The blog initially, that was for sure a part of it, but also just driving traffic to the website, that more content being created, the more traffic coming to the organization site. So that obviously brings in more people who are then emailing Congress or taking action or getting involved. But yeah, I think that was another one that was completely out of our scope of knowledge when we first started doing it, but kind of learning as we go, and still always learning. It's one of those areas that, as you know, changes a lot in terms of online journalism or online and the importance of journalism, plus SEO, search engine optimization, all that good stuff. So that's something we're always kind of learning and doing more and around. But for sure, anything we can do that kind of gets the issues out there more and people more engaged in different topics, that's always a good thing. So
I have a question. I'm sure this is a common question you get, but I'm just wondering, how do you avoid burnout? I mean, like, how are you staying motivated in those days where you were like working all day and then you had to go work at the restaurant at night? Like, at the end of the day, what was keeping you going there?
Yeah, I kind of mentioned this with the other group in the breakout session, but so early days, it was kind of fun and exciting because you're creating something out of nothing, and all of a sudden it's doing good things, and you're kind of starting to see there's kind of progress from the creation side of it to the, oh cool, we're seeing results side of it, and now we're starting to see things happen. And then from there it kind of goes into the, okay, I got to figure out how to keep this going. So I definitely got in a loop of like, just I was seeing the results, I didn't want to quit it. I knew if I quit and took a normal person job and maybe just went that route, it would just go under at that point, because at that point we didn't have staff. We really didn't have staff until year 10, any staff at all, myself included. So there was that kind of burden of, if you quit, it dies. And so that kind of kept me going. But it has been a struggle, and certain periods of life it's harder than others for sure. And just trying to keep it going. I don't have a great answer for you on techniques for sticking with it, but other than when you find yourself in situations, but for me, it helped a lot. Just, I believe strongly in what we're doing. And I saw there's a very, if you dissected my brain, there's a very direct connection between stuff I've seen on the ground and these powerful individuals that have the ability to change it that I meet with, and making sure those individuals are doing everything they're possible to help these other individuals. So that is kind of I think to help keep it going. But yeah, I'm coming up on year 20 of doing it, and it's kind of like, that's kind of weird to be doing the same thing for 20 years, even though it's something I'm completely passionate about and want to always do for the rest of my life. But it's just kind of unique nowadays because there's, most people, most of my friends have had multiple different careers and professions at this point. So that sticks in the head a little bit. But ultimately, this is, as long as I can have the most impact on the most people, this is kind of where I want to be, and I enjoy what I'm doing, and that helps a lot. But for whatever you guys go into, you will find there's a different set of challenges in life, from if something small starting out to something getting big. So that's kind of it makes for an interesting stuff. I guess I'm not really communicating that very well, but it's a different set of issues, I guess is what I'm saying. So my tip for everyone is, like, just realize there'll never be a point in life where everything's completely magical and going just the way you want it. There's always going to be these different little things going on, and sometimes success brings more of those little annoying things that challenges of life. So just the more you can kind of learn to find peace with yourself and balance work with not letting it distract your daily life. That's the secret to life, which we're all trying to do. So
That's great. Thanks. Isabel, you had your hand up.
Yeah, do you see any new like turns or additions to the Borgen project? Like Nora mentioned earlier, how you added a blog and a magazine.
Yeah, so right now there's quite a bit of talk. We're trying to do more around working with other wealthy nations as well. So, possibly we are in small process of starting a UK sector, working with the UK government and parliament. I've kind of resisted that for several years, and the reason is the US still has more capability to help more people than most other wealthy nations, whether it's the UK or France or Germany. So for me, it's where I want our focus to be. But we are kind of exploring if there's ways to take a sliver of what we're doing, and the challenge is not letting it become a distraction for organization, or not spending too much time on it. But we are doing kind of some pilot programs to try to see what we can do there. And that's been interesting because I don't have a clue how to influence the UK Parliament, but we're learning. And like everything else we've done along the years, it's just kind of do as much studying as you can, talk to the right people, and get a sense of if it makes sense. But so that's at what's going on at the moment. But that we'll probably doing more in terms of just branching out to other governments besides the US that can have influence on these issues.
Good. Yeah, Kevin, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just curious on what the large and current issues that you guys are facing right now.
Yeah. So generally, like every year, we're working on the appropriations around the international affairs budget. So that's something that's constant and ongoing. There's the COVID issue has been a bit challenging. I can't say it's been an area we've been hugely successful on. And when I say issue, it's getting vaccines into the parts of the world that just don't have access to it. It's still like a really small number that even people in the world that even have access to a vaccine. So and as I say, as long as it exists anywhere, it's going to exist everywhere. It's going to keep mutating and keep taking different forms. So that's pretty important, both domestically and internationally, that people have access to it who want to have access to it. So those are kind of the two main areas right now: appropriations and then COVID vaccine access.
So I'm not sure of the specifics when it comes to fundraising, although I can imagine that when you are asking, people to give money to you, I'm sure that those that actually give probably do insert or give their opinion of the Borgen project and the future of where it's going. And so if that has happened to you, how do you maintain a strong position on company values? Or have you been open to just new ideas from different fundraising people?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not going to say we've been lucky because we haven't had huge donors, but we have one who's still involved. He's great, and luckily his values line up with the organizations. But probably by virtue of what we do, you're most likely going to get people whose values sort of line up. I do look at political leaders though, and I'm like, oh man, there's a reason our system can get messy, because they have to raise the funding right to stay in office for their campaigns to be successful. They have to reach out to all kinds of people and raise money for them. But then you see like if you see where the influence could definitely be a real issue. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. I think part of it is we have a core set of areas we work on. I'll say that there's when people reach out like, oh, I got this idea, which I hear a lot of from, not just donors, but people involved or mildly interested or whatever. It is kind of you do always want to be careful on not pursuing stuff. And it's not just, I shouldn't say it's not just people that would have a lot of money that might donate and have influence. It could just be someone you really like and respect. It could be a staffer who I think is terrific and one of our best ever, and they come with an idea. I'm like, I'm not sure if that's a good idea, but there's, in the day, we're all humans, right? And we kind of boil down to those basic human reactions of wanting to, I think we all have a sense of wanting to please people. So you got to be very disciplined about not wanting to please everybody at the stake of the bigger picture of an organization. Does that make sense? But yeah.
Thank you.
Really good question though.
One thing, well, go ahead, Nora. Yeah.
I have another question, sorry. So I know that you talked about your time in refugee camps in Kosovo and then traveling to East Africa. Are there any pivotal moments or memories that you have that like when you are burnt out and that when you are tired, that you just like have that like reemerge to the forefront of your memory? And if so, what are they?
So this is sort of answering it, but sort of not. So I'd say that's not necessarily reemerge or tempered out, but one story that always sticks to my mind. So initially was over coast, I was in a refugee camp on the border of Macedonia. And this story comes to mind every time I go to the dentist, because when I go to the dentist, I complain like a sorry son of a gun. I'm like, no. But it just always reminds me like how dang lucky we are, like how stupid our problems are here. But there was a kid in the refugee camp and he had his tooth was falling out. That's particularly refugee camp. There's a lot of issues with people's teeth are rotting from, I think part of it was the diet there and then the malnutrition in general. So a lot of people had teeth issues, and I took him to there's Doctors Without Borders had a facility there, and they couldn't treat him, but they told me to go down to some dentists in the village there. So I took him and his brother down, and I walk in. It's like this dirty, nasty little building, and the guy is like drunker than drunk. That's dentist, and this is like I don't know, like 11 o'clock in the morning. So he is like I think he was trying to haggle with me. I didn't speak the language at all. He didn't speak English, but my guess is he's trying to get money on me. But which fair enough, you're right. But he was so long story short, very quickly, like he sits the kid in the chair. He takes pliers and rips the tooth out, and didn't give him any painkillers, nothing. And then he shoots the tooth like he's shooting a basketball towards a garbage can, and it misses and like bounces across this wood floor. And the kid's like, spitting out blood and all this stuff. And he looks at me, the kid looks at me like these horrible flat eyes. I just felt like so bad. I just felt like the worst human being for taking him to this guy. And then he turns, and what was the deal? Like his brother was like next, and his brother's like looking at me like, but I mean, all this happened like probably within the space of like I don't know, 60 seconds, maybe 2 minutes tops, of him whipping both kids through, shooting the whole 9 yards. And then as we're walking up, the older brother is telling his younger brother, say thank you. Like the older brother wanted the younger brother to thank me. I'm like, no, you do not need to thank me at all. That was horrible, horrible. But so that was just kind of one of those things, like there's just such a disconnect between some of our problems here. And I'm extremely guilty of it. I get settled back into life here, and you complain about going to the dentist, and God forbid I have to listen to the music while they operate with fully medical licensed equipment and professionals, and so it's just some of that stuff we just take for granted. So I try to keep some perspective on that, but it is hard. In the day, we kind of need to live the existence we have where we are, and you kind of fall into whatever groove you have going.
Thank you.
That touches on a question I was curious about also, which was, to what extent do you think encounters with the people that you're hoping to help around the world, to what extent do you think direct encounters like that are crucial to motivating people to act on their behalf? We think about that a lot here, and virtual encounters versus reading about other contexts or situations versus seeing people in different contexts here at home and maybe imagining what that circumstance might look like somewhere else in the world? Or do you feel like really bringing people to different parts of the world is what's required?
I think it's pretty huge. And in my perfect world, every college would require their students to go to one of these countries for at least a month or something. But yeah, it's pretty huge. And just, the people that get involved with our organization, a lot come from that background of, if you spend a week or 2 years in Peace Corps, whatever it is, just some kind of an involvement or some kind of witnessing it. A lot of times it's business leaders who, for business travel, we're going to this or that country, and we're pretty touched by it. What was interesting, and one positive thing to come out of the Afghanistan war, was it took a lot of members of Congress who wouldn't normally give a rat's tail about these issues. They would go out on these codels where they'd go visit Afghanistan and meet with the troops and see what's going on. And I had one guy point out to me, he's like, you can't go to those countries and just even the drive from the airport to wherever they're going and not see extreme poverty and not be moved by it. So that ironically sort of helped people get a lot of members of Congress somewhat, not necessarily fully engaged, but at least kind of open their eyes. And if they're, particularly some of those that are representing districts where they're just not exposed to very many people who care about those issues. So it's pretty, I'd say overall, it's pretty important. The more people can kind of at least get some sense of first person experience with it, it can be helpful.
Do you try to present that secondhand to congressmen and women through images or videos or things like that, or is it more testimonials or what?
It's a good question. So we my general tactic I meet with members of Congress is I do the what's in it for you approach. So I'm probably guilty of not. We've had this debate within the organization too, like maybe we should try to do more of the touchy-feely stuff, and I think we probably should do more of that. But I usually will go in and like point out like how much their congressional district has benefited by global poverty dropping over the last 20 years, and how this company in their district is now doing 60% of their business with such and such, business with Indonesia or one of these places where poverty rates have dropped. And so we try to frame it in very much why it should matter to them, whatever their ideology is. You try to frame it in a way that would match their ideology, so they basically have to argue against themselves to not be in favor of what we're bringing to them. But I think I think that would be impactful for sure. We currently have actually a member of our staff. He'd been an intern for us, really sharp guy, Fulbright scholar, but he had worked for the USAID over in Afghanistan. He's from Afghanistan, and he was part of that group that when the Taliban took over, his family had to go into hiding. And so he's here, his family's in hiding, and his family, his parents and sisters, and they're all in hiding in Afghanistan. He works for us now here at the Borgen Project, but he has been doing a lot of the lobbying. We've taken him to a lot of lobbying meetings, and he's been kind of doing a really good job of just kind of telling his story. And I think it's really helpful for the staff in particular, congressional offices, because really high turnover with congressional offices, House representatives most last 2 years. I think that's gone way down now since since COVID and certain events happening on Capitol Hill. But yeah, it's just massive turnover. So you're kind of constantly reintroducing the organization issues to new people. And I think we're kind of at the point where we probably are realizing we want to do more on the try to find ways to get touch them emotionally, or like get them some sense of connection to it if it's a staff that just hasn't ever really thought about the stuff or cared about it. So
that's helpful. Thanks. Other questions or comments or observations?
I'll throw a random life tip for y'all, because everyone needs life tips, even though we don't, but we do, right? I think when I was in college, I was like, oh my goodness, I got to figure out what I'm going to do. I have to have it all figured out. I'm going to graduate, and whatever I start doing the minute I graduate from college, that's going to be my entire life trajectory. And I need to make every decision right about where I work and get whatever job I think is right. And I am here to tell you that's not how life usually works. And there's not like a right and wrong answer. You might end up going different paths, but they're all going to probably be pretty good paths, because if you're a person who makes pretty good decisions on those things, which you all inevitably are, it works out. So I think there's a huge stress most people have in college, and definitely when you're near the end of college, to kind of find that perfect thing. And you think each step is, and these all are important, don't get me wrong, but there's just so much out there that hasn't, whatever you're going to be doing in 10 years probably hasn't been invented yet, or there's so much change going on. I would just really make a focus of going into stuff you like doing. And we've talked about this in some of the groups. It really doesn't have to be a nonprofit. You can be a person that cares about stuff and still go corporate route or go whatever route. But just find stuff you care about, enjoy doing. My other advice on that, though, is really find the good in whatever job you have. I definitely, through the years, seen a lot of people who are like, will get in somewhere and don't really take that job seriously, just use it as a stepping stone to the next thing. But really, whatever you do, just try to find what you enjoy in it. Because I think we're all kind of aiming for this end result of like some magical CEO of Google job or whatever it is. And there's just and meanwhile, life happens, right? So there's a lot going on, one example I always use, so we mentioned, Borgen Project's remote internship programs, and it's always been terribly interesting to me since we started this program. But the way it's structured, it's very structured. So a person gets hired, they're all basically doing the similar weekly assignments to the course of the internship. Depending on what program they go into, they'll have the exact same manager. And it's been interesting to me because you have people that at the end of their term, it was like a life-changing experience, just a wonderful experience for them. And other people who are like completely disgruntled by week 2 and quitting and going down the list. So, and there's zero difference, right? It's the exact same manager, exact same assignments, exact same organization. There's no variables, and they're doing it remotely. So it's not like they came in a late office one day and the manager now hates them. So it's like there's basically all variables have been eliminated, and you still get completely different outlooks from doing the exact same stuff. So my message on that is a lot of times we choose what we choose to like, and it has less to do with where we work. And they're all obviously exceptions to this. We've all had jobs we do and don't like. But there's also a lot to be said about making the best of whatever situation you're in. And you'll kind of be amazed how quickly you can grow within whatever organization you are in if you go in with kind of like the right attitude. And like everything else in life, what you put in is what you get out. So we definitely see that with people who really take time to learn about what they're doing in the organization, and those who seem to be more engaged, and then those that don't, obviously sometimes don't walk away with much out of the experience. So.
That is some really sage advice. Thank you seriously for that. I think those are really wise words. That might be a nice place for us to end, unless people have in mind some other questions. That's a nice thing to reflect on. But are there other questions before we go?
Great. Yeah, appreciate you guys taking time. And if I can answer any questions, do feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm just clint@borgenproject.org. So, but yeah, look, I appreciate you guys tuning in. So.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. And especially thank you, Clint, for taking the time out of we now know how many jobs you work and how many roles you play at home in addition to your office, just down to one now. Thanks so much for sharing all of that about your life's journey and about the values. They've given us an enormous amount to think about, and the work you do is honestly is so inspiring. And I think all of us here agree that it's important also. And thank you for the work that you do on behalf of people around the world, and for inspiring the people, whether you're on the young side or middle-aged like me, to do better and to do the things that can make a difference in the world. So thank you for the work you do. And we look forward to keeping in touch in the coming years. To the rest of you, to the students, good luck the last week of school and into exams and things like that. It's a pleasure to have you here as part of this session. And we'll be doing more of these starting in the fall again. So keep your eyes out for the Global Citizenship. There's a webpage, and we announce them in various newsletters and things like that. So keep your eyes peeled and keep in touch. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.